The permission is in the record. So are the locks. A Bureau of Industry and Security final rule, issued in January 2026, tells the story of a market reopened on paper and closed by clause, and most coverage stopped at the headline. The document grants what the years before had denied. It also, in every subsequent operative line, qualifies what it grants until the grant and the outcome are no longer the same object. This script reads that single rule twice, first for what its plain language establishes, then for what its careful phrasing conspicuously withholds. The document is the protagonist. Its silence is the argument. The Bureau of Industry and Security final rule of January 2026 reversed, in its operative language, the categorical prohibition that had governed exports of high-performance artificial intelligence accelerators to China since the October 2022 and October 2023 rules. Those earlier rules drew a hard performance threshold and denied everything above it. This rule replaces the hard line with a case-by-case licensing pathway. The H200, a chip Nvidia had not been permitted to sell into China, appears by name among the accelerators now eligible for review. Read at that surface level, the rule is what it was reported to be. The rule establishes that eligibility and approval are not the same word, but on a first reading, the distinction is easy to overlook. The text says, a license may be granted. It describes the reviewing authority, the documentation required, the categories of end user that qualify for expedited consideration. It also records, in plain language, a 25% tariff on covered chips. This figure appears in the text as a condition of lawful import, not as a sanction alongside the pathway. A first reading takes that at face value. The pathway exists, the tariff is its stated cost, and the market, in some operative sense, is open again. The rule authorizes review. It does not authorize shipment. Nowhere in the operative clauses does the document commit to a processing window, a default outcome, or a numerical target for licenses cleared. The permission it creates is a queue, and the rule is silent on how long that queue runs or how many applicants clear it. The record since, in which Nvidia disclosed in filings and earnings commentary available by early 2026 that approvals existed on paper while meaningful China revenue had not followed, is precisely what that silence predicted. The rule did not fail to deliver what it promised. It promised review. The rule attaches volume limitations. The document does not say what a buyer wanted. It caps what a buyer may receive. That gap between demand and permitted quantity is one of the more conspicuous omissions in the text. The rule records a ceiling, but nowhere records a floor, a minimum, or a guaranteed allocation. A buyer who qualifies, clears Know Your Customer review, passes third-party testing, and obtains a license may still receive fewer chips than the application requested. The rule says nothing about what happens to the remainder of the request. The rule requires compliance mechanisms it does not define in the operative text. Third-party testing is mandated. The rule does not name the testing bodies, establish their accreditation, or specify the timeline within which a test result becomes valid. Know Your Customer obligations appear as conditions of approval. The rule does not resolve what documentation satisfies them or who adjudicates a disputed submission. These are not small procedural gaps. They are the mechanism by which the case-by-case pathway absorbs months without any clause of the rule being violated. On a second reading, the 25% tariff is not incidental. It sits inside the approved pathway as a cost that applies to every cleared license, not as a penalty for non-compliance. The rule does not compare this figure to the margin profile of the chips it covers, and it does not need to. The arithmetic is the reader's problem. What the document records is that a buyer who completes the full compliance sequence, licensing, testing, Know Your Customer verification, volume allocation, then pays a quarter of the chip's value again at the border. The rule permits the sale. It does not say the sale is commercially equivalent to any sale that preceded the rule. The most consequential phrasing in the document is not a clause that adds a condition. It is a word that replaced another word. The rule does not contain the word approval. It contains the word review. A review process with no committed outcome, no timeline, no published approval rate, and no floor on volume is a permission structure in which every individual transaction remains contingent until it is not. The rule established a door. It did not establish that the door opens. Think of it this way. The rule functions like a building permit issued for a structure that still requires individual sign-off from the fire marshal, the electrical inspector, and the zoning board before any foundation is poured, and where none of those offices has published a scheduling window. The permit is real. The building is a separate question, and the permit does not answer it. The rule does not record Nvidia's internal forecasts, its negotiations with specific Chinese buyers, or the state of its order backlog as of the rule's effective date. Those figures exist in earnings filings and analyst disclosures, and they are not this document's job to contain. But their absence means a close reading of the rule alone cannot establish why approvals lagged, only that the rule's design permitted them to. The rule does not record what the reviewing authority's denial rate has been under analogous case-by-case pathways applied to other product categories or other destinations. That comparative record exists in published Bureau of Industry and Security statistics, but it is not in this text. An absent clause is not proof of intent to restrict. The same procedural form has, in other contexts, moved quickly. The rule may also be amended. Case-by-case review pathways have been tightened, loosened, and administratively reinterpreted within the life of a single licensing cycle before. This document establishes conditions as of January 2026, and the text itself contains no stability guarantee. What the record leaves unsettled is not a defect in the reading. It is the reading. A document that creates a permission structure without committing to its output is precisely what a says and does not say method is designed to surface, and the limits above are themselves additional lines. The rule chose not to write. The rule's operative language grants eligibility for review, not eligibility for a chip. That distinction is not a drafting oversight. It is the mechanism by which the rule simultaneously satisfies the political demand for a reopened market and preserves the administrative capacity to deliver nothing into it. The document's authors did not need to write a denial. They wrote a process, and a process is a permission whose outcome remains, by design, open. Framing the 25% tariff as a feature of the approved pathway, rather than a restriction alongside it, allows the rule to record an opening without recording its cost. The text is not misleading. It is precise. But precision here functions as omission. The rule establishes the tariff's existence and does not establish whether any Chinese buyer's margin calculation survives it, particularly for chips whose domestic alternatives closed the performance gap during the period the rule was being drafted. The rule names the cost. It does not evaluate the cost against the market it nominally reopened. The rule records a ceiling on approved volume, but is silent on any guaranteed minimum. In a case-by-case system, that silence means a fully compliant application can clear every procedural requirement and still receive a partial allocation. The rule does not record what happens to the remainder of the request. That omission matters because it is the omission Nvidia's own disclosures gestured toward when the company flagged the risk that domestic Chinese accelerator vendors, unencumbered by the same licensing sequence, could fill demand the rule permitted Nvidia to pursue, but did not ensure it could capture. The rule created a race in which one side needed no permission to run. Read once, the Bureau of Industry and Security Final Rule of January 2026 is a reopening. Read against its silences, the undefined timeline, the uncapped denial authority, the tariff embedded in the pathway, the volume ceiling with no corresponding floor, the testing requirements attached to unnamed bodies. The rule is a structure in which permission and outcome were always separate questions, and the document never promised they would converge. The wall is written into the text. It is written in the choice of review over approval, in the tariff recorded as a pathway feature rather than a penalty, in the volume cap that carries no corresponding guarantee. The response, the domestic accelerator programs that did not wait for a license, the buyers who did not wait for a cleared application, is in the margins the rule left blank. What the record establishes, finally, is not that the door was closed. It is that a door requiring this many keys was never, in any practical sense, open. If the license is the document that governs the sale, what does the approval letter, when one eventually appears, actually say? The next record worth reading closely is the first cleared license under this rule. What it permits, what it conditions, and what it leaves the buyer to determine on their own. If close readings of the documents that move these markets are useful to you, subscribe. The next one is already in the record.